The year was 1878, and the winter had come to eastern Montana with a teeth-baring snarl. The land was not white and quiet. It was a screaming expanse of gray ice and wind that clawed at the seams of the world. Clara Brody knew the sound of that wind. It was the only voice she heard most days. It pried at the chinking of her small cabin, promising to pull the weak sod roof down onto her head. She sat on a low stool, feeding precious scraps of dry cottonwood into the stove. The metal box was her only true friend, and it was a greedy one. She lived alone. She had been truly alone for 2 months, though she had felt alone for much longer. Her assets were few and easily counted. There was the cabin, which was failing. There was the barn. Leaning hard to the east, there was Barnabas, a mule whose primary talents were stubbornness and a profound hatred of the cold. And there was the rifle. It was a Winchester, heavy and oiled, leaning against the wall by the door, always within 3 steps of her hand. 1 rifle, 1 mule, and 1,000 miles of frozen prairie. It was not much to stand between a woman and the end of things. Her husband, Silas, was dead. He had died 2 months prior, just as the first snows were threatening. The official report, filed by a sheriff who had looked at Clara with greasy pity, called it an accident. Silas, they said, had been checking a trap line near the creek and had slipped from the high ledge, breaking his neck on the rocks below. Clara knew he had not slipped. She had been boiling laundry in the big kettle outside when it happened, the steam rising in the sharp air. She had heard a sound, not a slip, but a sharp, surprised cry, followed by a heavy, wet crack. By the time she grabbed the rifle and ran to the creek line, she saw only Silas, twisted like a broken doll on the stones, and the back of a rider disappearing over the far ridge. She had told the sheriff. He had nodded, stroked his mustache, and asked if Silas was a clumsy man. The locals in the tiny settlement of Prosperity, 20 miles west, had their own story. They whispered it over watered-down whiskey in Penley's saloon and over dry goods at the general store. Clara Brody, they said, had it coming. She was too proud. She had book learning and did not bother to hide it. She met a man's gaze instead of staring at his boots. And she was too cold. When they brought Silas's body back to the cabin, she had not wept. She had stood dry-eyed, her hands clenched at her sides, and asked them to please leave him on the porch, as she would handle the burial herself. They mistook her shock for ice. They mistook her terror for arrogance. They did not know that she had spent every ounce of her will not screaming. They did not know that her silence was the only armor she had left, so they whispered, and their whispers left her utterly isolated, a piece of drift in a frozen sea. One night, the wind stopped its howling and began to hiss. Sleet. It was a different kind of misery, a heavy, driving ice that coated the world in a 1/4-inch shell. Clara was mending a harness by the light of a single tallow candle, her fingers numb despite the stove. It was late, perhaps 9 o'clock. She heard Barnabas kick the inside of his stall in the barn. It was a sharp, panicked sound, not his usual complaint. Clara sighed, the breath fogging in the cabin's chill. Trouble with the mule was trouble she could not afford. She pulled on Silas's old canvas coat, which hung on her like a shroud, grabbed the lantern, and picked up the Winchester. She never went outside after dark without the rifle. She pushed the door open, and the sleet struck her face like a handful of flung gravel. The wind ripped the door from her grasp, slamming it back against the cabin wall. "Damnation," she muttered, pulling her scarf tighter. She wrestled the door shut and latched it from the outside, then shielded the lantern's flame with her coat. The world was a chaos of black and slashing silver. The 30 yards to the barn felt like a mile. Barnabas was braying now, a high, terrified sound that was half swallowed by the storm. "Hush, you old fool!" she yelled, fighting against the ice that had already crusted on the barn door's latch. She finally wrenched it free and slid inside. slamming the heavy door against the storm. The barn was cold, but the air was still. It smelled of hay and mule and something else, something metallic and wrong. Barnabas was pressed into the far corner of his stall, his eyes wide and white. "What is it, Barney?" Clara whispered, raising the lantern. The light fell first on a heap of wet canvas and snow just inside the door, something she had nearly tripped over. She thought it was a feed sack, dropped and forgotten. Then the heap groaned. Clara stopped breathing. She raised the rifle, the click of the hammer loud in the small space. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice tight. The heap moved again. A hand, gloved and dark, pushed away a layer of snow. It was a man. He was collapsed on his stomach, half curled, as if he had crawled this far before his strength gave out. He was a stranger. His hat was gone, his dark hair matted with ice and mud. She nudged him with her boot. He did not respond, save for another low sound, less a groan than a desperate intake of breath. Clara lowered the lantern, and she saw it. The snow around his right side was not white. It was a dark, slushy stain of pink and crimson, a frozen slurry of blood. He had been shot. Her first thought was clear and cold. Let him die. He was trouble. He was a man, and men were the architects of her ruin. If he was shot, he had earned it. He was an outlaw or a fool, and she had no charity for either. Leaving him meant one less problem. The storm would finish him by morning. It was the smart thing to do. It was survival. She watched him for a full minute, the lantern shaking in her hand, the rifle heavy in the other. He shivered, a violent rattling spasm that shook his whole frame. He was dying, but he was not dead yet. Clara cursed, a sharp, bitter word that the storm outside seemed to echo. She did not know why. But she could not. She could not be the same as the wind, the same as the whispers, the same as the men who pushed other men from ledges. She set the rifle down, grabbed the man by the collar of his coat, and began to drag him. He was heavier than a winter-killed buck. It was a dead, dragging weight. She grunted, her boots slipping on the icy floorboards as she pulled him out of the barn and into the screaming sleet. The 30 yards back to the cabin were a special kind of hell. She fell twice, her knees slamming against the frozen ground. He was half conscious, moaning softly, his blood leaving a faint trail that the sleet covered almost instantly. She got him to the door, wrestled him over the threshold, and kicked the door shut. The latch fell, and the storm was outside once more. The cabin was suddenly terribly small. He lay on her floor, a bleeding, half-frozen piece of the wilderness she had just dragged inside. He was breathing in shallow, rasping pants. The fever was already on him. She could feel the heat rolling off his skin even through his wet clothes. For a moment, she panicked. What had she done? Then, the numbness that had saved her for 2 months took over. She had a thing to do. She stoked the fire until it roared. She lit every candle she had, pushing back the shadows. She fetched her sewing kit, a bottle of whiskey Silas had kept hidden, and the sharpest knife she owned. She cut his coat away, then his shirt. The clothes were stiff with frozen blood. When his chest was bare, she saw the wound. It was ugly. A bullet had gone clean into his right side, just below the ribs. It looked to have missed the lung, but it was deep, and it was still weeping blood. She poured a cup of whiskey and knelt beside him. "Mister, can you hear me? You need to drink this." His eyes fluttered open. They were gray, not blue, not brown, but the color of gunmetal, flat and depthless. He looked at her, and there was no gratitude, there was no fear. There was only a cold, sharp, assessing light, and then a wave of pain shut them again. "Drink," she ordered. She lifted his head and pressed the cup to his lips. He coughed, but he swallowed, the liquor burning his throat. He hissed. "This will hurt," she said, more to herself than to him. She took the rest of the bottle and poured it directly onto the wound. The man did not scream. His whole body went rigid. A bowstring pulled tight. A low, animal sound tore from his throat, but he did not cry out. Clara's hands were shaking, but she threaded the needle. She had stitched torn canvas, and she had stitched Barnabas's flank after a wolf attack. This was just meat. She set to work. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her stomach turning. As she worked, her fingers brushed against something on his ribs. Just below the wound, it was a scar, but not from a knife or a bullet. It was a brand. She held the lantern closer. It was an old wound, healed over in a puckered, silvery ridge. It was a single letter, M. She stopped, the needle poised. A brand meant he was property, or had been, a runaway apprentice, a soldier, or something worse, a man marked for murder, or rustling, or some other sin so deep it had to be burned into his skin. A silent fury rose in her. She had brought a devil into her home. His eyes opened again. He was watching her. He was fever-bright, but he was aware. He saw her looking at the brand. His gaze did not waver. It was hard, challenging, and full of a quiet rage that matched her own. Clara turned back to her work. She put in the first stitch, pulling the flesh together. He grunted, but did not move. She put in the second, the third. She worked grimly, her mouth a thin, hard line. She was not saving a man. She was just closing a hole. When she was done, she wrapped his torso in clean bandages made from a ripped-up flour sack. She dragged him onto her own narrow cot. She could sleep by the fire, and covered him with every blanket she owned. In his delirium, he spoke only one word, Jed. It was not a request, just a name, breathed into the dark. Jed. No last name, just a wound, a brand, and a silent fury in his eyes. Clara sat in her rocker, the rifle across her lap, and watched him fight the fever for the rest of the night. For 3 days, the storm held them prisoner. The sleet turned to a driving snow, piling in drifts that buried her windows and muffled the world in a terrifying white silence. Inside the cabin, the silence was just as heavy, broken only by Jed's fevered breathing or the crackle of the fire. He did not speak. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Clara developed a routine born of grim necessity. She melted snow for water. She fed him the last of her thin rabbit broth, lifting his head, forcing the spoon between his cracked lips. He took it mechanically, his eyes closed. She changed his bandages twice a day. The wound was angry, the flesh around it hot and red, but it was not rotting. The whiskey and the cold had kept the worst of the infection at bay. She slept in her rocking chair, the Winchester leaning against her leg. She woke at every sound he made, a cough, a shift of weight, a muttered curse in his sleep. She was a coiled spring, terrified of the moment the fever would break, the moment his strength would return. What if he was dangerous? The question was absurd. Of course he was dangerous. The brand proved it. The bullet hole proved it. The way he had taken the whiskey and the needle proved it. He was a man made of violence. She had invited a wolf to heal at her hearth, and she was beginning to fear what would happen when he was no longer lame. And yet, she found herself drawn to him. It was not a soft feeling. It was a raw, unwilling curiosity. She studied him in the long, silent hours. He was built hard, his shoulders broad even as he lay sick. His hands, resting on the blanket, were scarred and capable. There was no part of him that was gentle. He was a tool made for a hard job. She had known men like Silas, men who spoke of their strength, who boasted and blustered, but who were soft and complaining underneath. This man, Jed, was the opposite. He was all quiet strength. He endured the pain without a single word of complaint. He simply existed, fighting his own body for survival, and he seemed to demand nothing from her. He was a force, and his presence, as frightening as it was, pushed back against the crushing loneliness she had endured. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The sun came out. a pale, weak disk in a white-blue sky. Clara woke from a stiff-necked sleep in her chair to find him awake. He was not feverish. His eyes were clear, and they were fixed on her. He had been watching her sleep. Clara's hand instinctively went to the rifle. He saw the movement. He did not flinch. He just kept staring, his expression unreadable. It was not the look of a predator. Exactly. It was the look of a man studying the land before a gunfight, memorizing every rise, every shadow, every escape route. He was studying her. "The storm is over," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. He nodded once. His gaze dropped to the rifle, then back to her face. "Where is my gun?" His voice was a low rasp, like stones dragging over sand. "I didn't find one," she said. It was the truth. He had come with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bullet in his side. He seemed to consider this, his gray eyes narrowing. He believed her. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, hissing as the stitches pulled. "Don't," Clara said, standing up. "You'll tear the wound." "Water," he said. It was not a request. She ladled water from the bucket into a cup and brought it to him. She did not get close enough for him to grab her. She held it out. He had to reach. Straining his wounded side, he took the cup from her, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was rough, but his touch was steady. He drank the entire cup in 3 long swallows, his eyes never leaving her face. He handed the cup back. "My thanks," he said. The words sounded foreign on his tongue, as if he rarely used them. "I didn't do it for thanks," Clara said, backing away to the stove. "I did it because I'm not a savage." He watched her, the silence stretching again, but it was a different silence now. The fever was gone. The delirium was gone. There was just a man, a very large, very dangerous man, on her cot, and a woman with a rifle standing by the fire. His presence unnerved her more than the storm, more than the loneliness. But as he looked at her, she felt something else, a strange, unwelcome recognition. When the men in prosperity looked at her, they saw a cold widow, a problem, or an opportunity. When Silas had looked at her, he had seen a possession, something to complain about. When Jed looked at her, he seemed to see the calluses on her hands, the exhaustion in her shoulders, and the rifle she held so capably. He was not looking at a woman. He was looking at a survivor. For the first time in years, Clara Brody felt seen, and it terrified her more than the bullet wound ever could. The snow stopped, but the world did not move. For 4 days, the drifts lay heavy and high, burying the prairie in a white shroud that reached the bottoms of the cabin's 2 small windows. The silence was absolute, a heavy press against the ears. They were trapped, the settlement of prosperity, 20 miles distant, might as well have been on the moon. Clara had slept in the rocker for 3 nights, her neck a misery of stiff muscle. On the 4th morning, Jed swung his legs off the cot. "I will take the chair," he said. It was not an offer. "You will not," Clara replied, measuring coffee grounds. "You'll sleep on the floor if you move off that cot. You tear those stitches, you'll bleed out before I can find the needle." He looked at the cot, then at her. He understood the equation. He needed her to heal. She needed him. She wasn't sure what she needed him for. A ballast. Another body in the cabin that kept the wind from sounding so lonely. "I can work," he said. "You can sit," she countered. But the next day, the wound in his side clearly aching, he proved her wrong. The stalemate of their confinement was broken by the pressing needs of survival. The first task was the roof. The weight of the snow and ice had sprung a leak in the northeast corner, directly over her dry goods. A steady, agonizing drip. Drip, drip struck the floor. "Move the sacks," he ordered. He was already on his feet, his jaw tight against the pain. She did. They worked together in the close, cold space. She handed him the bucket of tar Silas had kept for repairs. He climbed onto the small table, bracing himself against the roof beams. She held the table steady. He was close enough that she could smell the faint, metallic scent of his healing wound, mixed with the wood smoke that clung to his clothes. He worked with a grim, focused economy. No wasted motion. He found the gap in the sod and timber and packed it, his breath hissing between his teeth. Clara watched his shoulders move under the patched wool shirt. He was still weak, but the power in him was obvious. It was like watching a banked fire. The heat was there, even if the flames were low. He finished, stepping down heavily. He swayed, and Clara instinctively put a hand on his arm to steady him. It was the first time she had touched him outside of nursing his wound. His arm was solid muscle, tense and hot. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Clara pulled away as if she had touched the stove. "I am fine," he said, moving stiffly back to the cot. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow. The next day, they dug their way out. The drifts had packed hard against the cabin and barn doors. It took them 2 hours of grim, shared labor with the cabin's 2 shovels. Clara's hands were raw inside her mittens. Jed worked slower than she did, but his rhythm was relentless. Every shovelful was a full one. He stopped only once, leaning against the cabin wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. He closed his eyes, breathing hard, the wound a sharp, stabbing pain. Clara stopped, too. She did not ask if he needed rest. She just waited, watching the plume of her own breath. He opened his eyes. They were that same flat, unreadable gray. He picked up the shovel and began again. When they finally cleared the path to the barn, Barnabas brayed in loud, profane relief. The mule was unharmed, but the small stack of hay was nearly gone. Worse, the weight of the snow had snapped the top rail of the corral, a secondary fence post near the lean-to. Jed inspected the break. "This needs to be fixed before dark. A wolf gets in here, that mule is gone." "I have no timber," Clara said. "The wood pile is low, and nothing is dry." Jed looked toward the small stand of cottonwoods near the frozen creek. He picked up the axe. "You can't," she said, alarmed. "Chopping wood will split you open." "And sitting still will freeze us to death," he retorted. "We need the fence post. We need the fire." He went to the trees. Clara followed, carrying the Winchester, her eyes scanning the unbroken white of the prairie. The world felt too bright, too empty. She watched him. He could not swing the axe wide. His side would not allow it. Instead, he used his weight, cutting with short, precise, brutal strokes. He found a dead-standing trunk and felled it in 10 minutes. He did not pause. He limbed it, then cut a 6-foot length for the post. Then he turned to the remaining wood and began cutting it into rounds for the stove. The steady thunk, thunk, thunk of the axe was the only sound in the vast, cold world. It was a sound of purpose, a sound of life. Silas had hated chopping wood. He had complained and done it badly, leaving her to split most of it. Jed worked until a small mountain of pale wood lay at his feet. He was breathing heavily, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the freezing air. "That's enough," Clara said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You've done enough." He stopped, the axe head buried in the snow. He looked at the wood, then at her, and gave a single, curt nod. They dragged the wood back to the cabin and fixed the post as the sun bled watery orange across the horizon. They worked without speaking. She held the post steady while he used the heavy mallet to pack the frozen earth around its base. Their hands brushed. Their shoulders bumped. Each touch was an accident, and each accident sent a jolt through the cold air. That night, the cabin was warm for the first time in weeks. The stove was full, the air thick with the smell of green cottonwood smoke. Clara was checking on Barnabas, giving him the last of the oats. When she returned to the cabin, she pushed the door open without knocking. It was her home, after all, and stopped. Jed was standing by the stove, the lantern light cutting shadows across his chest. He was shirtless. He had a damp cloth in one hand and was cleaning the stitches she had put in his side. The wound was healing. It was a vicious purple red, but the edges were clean. But it was not the wound that held her gaze. It was his back. His back, from his shoulders to his waist, was a map of old, healed-over scars. They were thin, silvery lines, overlapping, crossing, weaving a terrible story. Lash scars, dozens of them, so many they blurred into a ruined landscape of raised flesh. He heard her. He did not turn, but his shoulders tensed, his whole body going rigid. He was waiting for her gasp, for her pity, for her disgust. Clara stood in the doorway, the cold air rushing around her ankles. She did not gasp. She did not speak. She simply stood and looked. She looked at the brand on his ribs, the mark of ownership. She looked at the scars on his back, the marks of punishment. She understood, in that moment, why he stared at the world as if it were a gunfight. He had been in one his entire life. She quietly closed the door, shutting out the cold. He remained frozen for another second, his back to her. Then, slowly, he picked up his shirt and pulled it over his head. When he turned, his face was a mask, his eyes harder than she had ever seen them. Clara ignored it. She moved to the stove and began to stir the thin rabbit stew she had simmering. It was all they had. "It's healing," she said, nodding toward his side. "You'll live." "It seems so," he said, his voice flat. They ate in silence. The stew was mostly water and a few stringy pieces of meat, but it was hot. Jed ate quickly, his eyes on his bowl. The tension from the barn, from the roof, from the woodpile, had now drawn taut between them. It was the scars. They hung in the air, unspoken. Clara put her spoon down. "Who?" He did not pretend to misunderstand. He kept his gaze on the table. "A man who thought he owned me. I was an apprentice. He called it at a freighting company. He had the brand put on me when I was 14, to prove I was his." "And the whip?" she asked, her voice low. "That was for when I forgot." "What did you forget?" A muscle jumped in his jaw. "To kneel." He looked up, and his eyes met hers. "I left when I was 17. I took his horse, his gun, and his wallet. I did not kill him. I have regretted that." Clara absorbed this. It was a brutal story, told in brutal, simple terms. "And the bullet?" she asked. He hesitated. He looked at the fire, then back at her. "I fell in with a crew, in the Arizona territory. Men who, we dealt justice. The law wouldn't ride into those canyons, so we did." "Vigilantes," she whispered. "Some called us that. We called ourselves the Forgotten. We hunted men who needed hunting. Rustlers, murderers, men who hurt women." Clara's breath caught. It was a clean life for a dirty job. Jed continued, his voice a low rumble. "Until it wasn't, the crew got loud. They started to like the fear they caused. It stopped being about justice and started being about money, about power. So I left." "You left, and they shot you for it?" "No," he said. "I left 3 years ago. But you don't leave that life cleanly. There are always accounts to settle. An old friend, a brother of a man I dealt with. He found me. I was passing through, headed north. He found me outside prosperity." He had told her more in 5 minutes than Silas had told her in 3 years of marriage. He was a branded man, a runaway, a vigilante, and a fugitive. He was everything she should have feared. Before she could reply, a loud, heavy fist pounded on the cabin door. Clara shot to her feet. Grabbing the Winchester from the wall, Jed was already moving, melting into the darkest corner of the cabin, away from the door, his hand instinctively going to his wounded side. "Who is it?" Clara called, her voice sharp. "Just a neighbor, Mrs. Brody, making sure you survived the storm." The voice was oily and smooth, a voice she knew too well. "Stand back from the door," she ordered. She lifted the latch, holding the rifle angled at the floor. The door swung open, bringing a gust of cold air and the man himself. Tom Penley. He filled the doorway. A big man who had gone soft around the middle. He wore a thick buffalo coat and a bowler hat, and he smelled of cigar smoke and the whiskey he sold at his saloon. The Golden Spike. He was the most powerful man in prosperity, with a sheriff in his pocket and a hand in every political game in the territory. His eyes swept the cabin, landing first on Clara, then on the rifle, and finally, with sharp surprise, on Jed. "Well, well," Penley said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He stepped inside, forcing Clara to back away. He removed his hat, revealing slick, dark hair. "I see you haven't been alone. Clara, taking in strays?" "He was hurt in the storm," Clara said, her voice cold. She did not lower the rifle. "State your business, Mr. Penley." "My business," Penley chuckled. He looked Jed up and down, sizing him up. He saw the patched clothes, the rough look. He saw a nobody. "My business is civil, my dear. I was worried. A woman alone. A proud woman like you. It's a hard country. Hard to keep hold of what's yours." "I am managing," Clara said. "Are you?" Penley reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "Because the county ledger says you aren't. It says you're 2 months behind on your property taxes." Silas, God rest his clumsy soul, was never very good with money. Clara stared at the paper. "That can't be. Silas paid them through the year." Silas thought he did, but there was a new assessment. "The railroad is thinking of surveying this way. Land values are going up," Penley said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You owe $20 by the end of the week, or the county seizes the property." $20. He might as well have asked for the sun. She had less than 2. "I don't have it." "A shame. A terrible shame," Penley said. He stepped closer. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle, but he ignored it. He was looking at her, his gaze thick and appraising, like she was livestock. "Of course, the county is reasonable. I have sway with the commissioner. If a friend were to speak on your behalf, if you were perhaps a little more welcoming." He let the word hang in the air. His gaze flickered to the cot, then back to her face. He was implying a trade, her body for his mercy. "A woman as cold as you, Clara," he whispered, "must get awful lonely out here. It doesn't have to be that way." From the corner of the room, there was a sound, the scrape of a boot. Jed had moved. He was standing, no longer in shadow. He was just watching Penley, his gray eyes flat and devoid of all light. He looked like a wolf deciding which part of the sheep to eat first. Penley, for all his bluster, felt the shift in the room. He looked at Jed, his bravado wavering for just a second. "You keep strange company." Clara. "He's hired help," Clara said, finding her voice. "Is he?" Penley forced his smile back. He placed the paper on her small table. "The end of the week. Think on my offer. It's a cold world. A welcoming woman stays warm." He put his hat on, gave Jed one last dismissive look, and left, pulling the door shut behind him. The cabin was silent. The air felt foul, coated in the man's scent. Clara's hands were shaking so badly she had to set the rifle down. She was shaking with a rage so profound it made her sick. She stared at the paper on the table. $20. "Why didn't you shoot him?" Jed's voice cut through the stillness. Clara turned, stunned. "What?" "He threatened you. He put his hands on you." Jed's voice was calm, analytical. "He deserved it. Why didn't you shoot him?" "Because this isn't one of your canyons. Jed," she snapped, her control breaking. "This isn't your kind of justice. You don't know—" "I know a snake when I see one." "And what happens after I shoot him?" she cried, the words tearing out of her. His friends come. The sheriff, who eats at his table, comes. They drag me into town. They'll call me a whore for having you here. They'll say I killed him for money. Or maybe they won't even bother with a trial. Maybe they'll just hang me from the saloon rafters." She advanced on him, her fists clenched. "I have seen what happens when a woman kills a man, even to stay alive. I saw it in Kansas. A girl shot a freighter who tried to drag her into an alley. They called her a lunatic. They put her in a cage until she starved to death. That is the law. Jed, that is the justice we get." She was out of breath. The fury left her as quickly as it had come, leaving her hollowed out, empty. She sank onto the stool by the fire, her shoulders slumped. The fight was gone. She stared into the flames. The night deepened. The fire popped and hissed. Jed did not move from his corner. He just watched her, his face grim. She had fought so hard. She had built a wall around herself, a wall of coldness, of pride, of silence. She had made herself plain, kept her eyes down, learned to be invisible. She had thought if she was cold enough, quiet enough, strong enough, they would leave her alone. Silas hadn't left her alone. The whispers hadn't left her alone. And now Tom Penley. "It doesn't work," she whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost to the wind. "What doesn't?" Jed asked. Clara didn't look up. She felt the tears, hot and sudden, tracking down her cheeks. She had not cried when Silas died. She had not cried when the sheriff dismissed her. She cried now, in the face of her own helplessness. "Being invisible," she said, her voice thick. "Before Silas, before I came west, I was in St. Joseph. I was assaulted by a man who worked for my father. When I told my father, he slapped me. He said I must have invited it. He said I was ruined." She wiped her face with a shaking hand. "So I left. I married Silas because he was moving west. And he was the only man who would have me. And I made myself into someone no one would want to touch. I made myself cold, proud. I made myself invisible, so no one would ever try to hurt me again." She looked at him then, her eyes raw. "It doesn't work. They still see you. They still come for you. They just call you a bitch while they do it." She had told no one. Not Silas, not anyone. Jed was silent for a long time. The cabin was so still she could hear the tiny hiss of the melting snow dripping from the eaves. He crossed the small room in 2 strides. He stopped in front of her. She flinched, expecting... She didn't know what. Pity, disgust. He did not offer either. He just stood there, a great, scarred shadow. Then, slowly, he reached out one hand. It was not a soft hand. It was calloused and hard. He did not touch her face or her hair. He laid his hand gently on her shoulder, his grip firm. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of grounding, an anchor. Clara stopped shaking. "You're stronger than I thought," Jed whispered. His voice was rough, but the words were clear. She looked up at him. He was not looking at her with lust, like Penley. He was not looking at her with dismissal, like the sheriff. He was looking at her with a stark, brutal recognition. He saw the scars on her, even though they were on the inside. And in that moment, the raw, aching need that had lived beneath her cold armor for years finally broke free. It was not just desire. It was a desperate, primal need to be held, to be seen, to be anchored by another human being who understood what it meant to be marked by the world. She reached up and grabbed the front of his shirt. Her knuckles brushed the hard warmth of his chest. "Don't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't sleep in the chair tonight." His gray eyes searched hers. He was looking for a trick. He found none. He saw only her raw, exposed pain and the matching need. He did not speak. He leaned down and cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her to her feet. Their first kiss was not soft. It was clumsy and desperate. A collision of mouths starved for contact. It tasted of salt from her tears and smoke from the fire. It was not gentle. It was raw, aching, and full of a terrible, shared understanding. He picked her up. He was still wounded, and he grunted at the pain. But he did not falter. He carried her the 2 steps to the narrow cot, the one he had slept in, the one that still held his warmth. He laid her down and followed, his weight pressing her into the thin mattress. This was not the fumbling of Silas, or the violence of the man in St. Joseph. This was something else entirely. He was not tender, but he was present. His hands were rough as they moved over her, but they were sure. He mapped the lines of her body through the rough wool of her dress, as if learning her, and she clung to him, her fingers digging into the muscles of his back, feeling the terrible raised network of his scars. They were 2 broken, damaged things, and they did not try to heal each other. They simply surrendered their pain to the moment. He unbuttoned her dress, and she helped him with his shirt, their hands fumbling in the dim light. When their skin touched, it was not a gentle caress, it was a shock, like fire on ice. He was all hard muscle and scarred flesh, and she was trembling, not with fear, but with a desperate, sharp-edged desire. He moved over her, and for a second, she tensed, the old fear rising. He saw it. He stopped. He rested his forehead against hers, his breath coming hard. "Clara," he rasped. It was the first time he had used her name. "Stay," she whispered. "Please." He entered her, and it was a release, a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. It was not soft. It was fierce and desperate and honest. It was a claiming. Not him claiming her, but both of them claiming this one night, this one moment of life in a world that had offered them nothing but death and pain. They moved together with a raw, unspoken rhythm, 2 survivors clinging to the same piece of wreckage. When it was over, he did not pull away. He collapsed onto her, his weight a comfort, his face buried in her hair. She held him, her arms wrapped tight around his scarred back. And for the first time since she had come to this God-forsaken land, Clara Brodie did not feel cold. The morning brought a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of isolation, nor the strained quiet of 2 strangers. It was the heavy, awkward silence of a line crossed. Clara woke first, her body tangled with his on the narrow cot. He was heavy and warm and breathing deeply. His arm was draped over her waist, his hand resting near her hip. It felt possessive. It felt safe. She lay still, watching the gray light filter through the single, ice-crusted window, and did not know what to do next. This was not part of any plan. When he stirred, his body tensing as consciousness returned, she felt a flash of panic, but he did not speak. He did not offer apologies or pretty words. He simply untangled himself from her, swung his legs off the cot, and stood up, his back to her. He pulled on his shirt, his movements stiff. The lash scars were pale in the dim light. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, her dress a rumpled heap on the floor. "I'll see to the mule," Jed said, his voice a low rasp. He grabbed his coat. "Jed," she said. He paused, his hand on the door latch, but did not turn. The cot," she started, her voice faltering. "It's too small for 2. I can sleep in the chair." He turned then, his face grim. "No, we will share it, or I will take the floor. I won't have you in the chair." "It's my home," she said, a flash of the old pride returning. "And it's under siege," he replied, his voice flat. "We are in this together, Clara. Whether you like it or not, we'll make it fit." He left. Clara watched the door swing shut, the cold air swirling around her feet. He had said we. She had been an I for so long, the word felt strange. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling, her mind racing. What had she done? She had invited a fugitive, a branded man, into her bed. She had tied herself to his fate. But when she went to the stove and found he had already filled the wood box before leaving, the panic began to subside. It was replaced by something else, a practicality. He was right. They were in this together. Their connection, born in desperation and sealed in the dark, did not soften in the light of day. It deepened. It became practical. The cabin was no longer her refuge. It was their shared foxhole. They spoke little of the night before. Instead, they spoke of the weather, of the low supply of flour, of the fence line. But the awareness was constant. It was in the way he handed her a cup of coffee, his fingers brushing hers. It was in the way she mended a tear in his coat, the smell of him rising from the wool. They were a team. His strength returned quickly. The man was built of iron. Within a week, the wound in his side was a puckered, healing line, and he moved without a limp. And with his strength, he began to change her. "You hold it wrong," he said one afternoon. The deadline for Penley's tax had passed 3 days ago. No one had come. The snow, and perhaps Penley's patience, had granted them a reprieve, but they both knew it was temporary. Clara was cleaning the Winchester, a task she did every 3rd day. "What do you mean?" she asked. "You hold it like it's a broomstick," he said. He took the rifle from her. His hands were large, covering the stock and barrel. "You let it rest. You don't fight it. You make it part of you." He took her outside, into the blinding white sunlight. He set up a tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. "Show me," he said. She raised the rifle, nestled the stock into her shoulder as Silas had shown her. It felt heavy. She squinted, the front sight wavering. "No," he said. He stepped behind her. She tensed as his body pressed against her back. He was a wall of heat in the cold air. His left hand came around her, covering her hand on the forestock. His right hand settled over hers at the trigger. His chin brushed her hair as he sighted down the barrel. "Breathe out," he commanded, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Don't hold your breath. Breathe out. And when you are empty, you squeeze. You don't pull." His hand tightened over hers, pressing her finger against the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the sound flat and loud in the snow. The can did not move. "You're anticipating," he said, his voice calm. "You're afraid of the noise. Don't be. It's just a tool. Let your shoulder take the kick. It can handle it." He stepped back. Again. She loaded another cartridge. She tried again, forcing his voice into her head. "Breathe out. Squeeze." She fired. The can jumped and fell into the snow. A slow smile touched her lips. She had never hit it on the first try. "Again," he said. They spent the afternoon shooting. He taught her how to reload faster, how to track a moving target, how to clear a jam without taking her eyes off the threat. He was a harsh teacher, demanding and patient. He was giving her his own hard-won survival. The lessons did not stop with the gun. He took her to the creek line, where the snow was disturbed by tiny tracks. "You're looking for rabbits," he said, kneeling. "But you're looking in the open. They don't run in the open. They run in the brush. You're setting your snares too high." He showed her how to find the game trails, small tunnels in the undergrowth. He showed her how to fashion a better snare from the wire she had, one that would catch, not just warn. He showed her how to read the snow, not as a white blanket, but as a story. This track was a fox, this one a deer mouse, this one a coyote, and it was fresh. She watched his scarred hands work with the wire, and she learned. The land, which had been her enemy, started to feel like a pantry. The next week, a thaw came. The snow receded, leaving the world a muddy, brown ruin, and with the thaw came new trouble. Clara was chopping wood. She had taken over the task, her body stronger now, when she saw them. 3 steers, dull-eyed and bony, picking their way through a break in her south fence. They were branded with a lazy H. "Amos Hrexka," she spat. Hrexka was her closest neighbor, 5 miles to the south. He was a lazy man who let his cattle roam, saving himself the cost of feed. Silas had always complained, but had never done more than chase them off. "They're back," she said to Jed, who was sharpening the axe. "What do you do?" he asked. "I chase them off, and they come back next week." Jed looked at the cattle, then at her. He said nothing. He just watched. A new, cold anger settled in Clara. She had been bullied by Penley, whispered about by the town, and now she was being stolen from by a lazy neighbor. "No," she said. She dropped the axe. "Not this time." She began walking toward the Hrexka homestead, her boots sucking in the mud. She did not look back. She did not have to. After a dozen paces, she heard his steady footfalls behind her. He was matching her stride for stride, his presence a shadow at her back. They walked the 5 miles in silence. Hrexka's farm was even more run down than hers, the yard littered with broken tack and chicken droppings. Hrexka himself was on his porch, tilted back in a chair, whittling. He saw her coming, and his face, usually slack and amiable, tightened. When he saw Jed, a few paces behind her, his hand stopped moving. "Mrs. Brody," he said, not standing. "A pleasant surprise. Your cattle are on my land. Amos." Clara said. She stopped 10 feet from the porch. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She stated a fact. "Well now," Hrexka chuckled, his eyes flicking to Jed. "The snow's melted. Critters will roam. You know, that's just nature. The fence they broke is not nature." Clara said, "You will come and get your steers, and then you will mend the fence you let them break." Hrexka's smile faded. He slowly brought his chair down to all 4 legs. "That's a strong tone. Clara, a woman alone ought to be more neighborly. Silas," he understood. "Silas is dead," Clara said, her voice flat. "And I am not him. Get your cattle. Fix my fence. If I see them on my land again, I will shoot them, butcher them, and sell the meat." Hrexka's face went red. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Clara said. Jed had not moved. He stood with his arms crossed, his face impassive. He was just a shadow, but he was a shadow that had weight. Hrexka looked from Clara's cold, determined face to the scarred, silent man behind her. He saw the way Jed watched him, not with anger, but with a kind of bored patience, like a man waiting for an excuse. Hrexka swallowed. He looked at the ground, then back at Clara. "Fine," he muttered. "No need to be ugly. I'll get him this afternoon." "And the fence," Clara reminded him. "And the fence," he grumbled. Clara nodded once. "See that you do." She turned and walked away. Jed fell in step beside her. Neither of them spoke until they were nearly home. "He will," Jed said quietly. Clara looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She had faced a man down, and she had not been afraid. She had not needed the rifle. She had just needed the will and the shadow. "Yes," she said, "he will." That night, the victory felt hollow. It had been a small fight, but the war with Penley was still waiting. The fear returned, settling in her stomach. She slept, but her sleep was troubled. She was back at the creek, the steam from the laundry kettle, the sound of voices sharp and angry. Silas shouting, Penley's low, cold tones. She heard a smack, Silas, swinging, and then the cry, that short surprised grunt as he went over the edge. She saw Penley's back as he rode away, the same way she had seen it in life. Clara woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in the narrow cot. Her heart was hammering, her skin slick with cold sweat. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to red gold embers. "You're safe," Jed's voice came from the dark. He was awake. He was always awake. He struck a match and lit the lantern. The small, yellow light filled the cabin. He was sitting up beside her, his face etched with concern. The dream again? She had had nightmares before, but never this one. Not this real. It wasn't a dream, she whispered, her voice shaking. I was there. She looked at him, the truth rising in her throat. A truth she had buried for 2 months. A truth so heavy she had not dared speak it. I saw it, Jed, she said. I saw him die. His face did not change, but his eyes sharpened. What did you see? I was outside, she said, pulling the blanket tight. Boiling the laundry. They rode up to the creek line, Silas and Penley. I couldn't hear it all. Arguing about money, about the taxes. I think Penley said Silas was a fool. She was shaking now, the memory vivid. Silas, he had a temper. He yelled. He swung at Penley. He missed. And Penley, he put his hands on Silas's chest, and he pushed. It was so easy, so quiet. Silas he went over. He didn't even scream, just a gasp. And then that awful sound. You saw Penley push him, Jed stated. Yes, I saw his back as he rode away. He never even looked at me. I don't think he knew I was there. You told the sheriff. I told the sheriff Silas fell and I saw a rider, she said, a bitter taste in her mouth. Who would I accuse? Tom Penley? The most powerful man in the county? Against me? A woman? They would have said I was mad. Or worse, that I was lying to cover my own sin. That I killed Silas myself. She looked at Jed, her eyes pleading for him to understand. They already whisper that I'm too cold. They would have believed it. Penley would have seen me hanged. Jed was silent. The fury that she had expected, the outrage, was not there. Instead, his face settled into a cold, hard stillness. It was the quietest fury she had ever seen. He got out of the cot, his movements stiff. He walked to the stove and stared into the dying embers. Men like that don't stop, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He killed your husband. He tried to claim the land with his false tax. When that didn't work, he tried to persuade you. He turned to face her, his gray eyes like chips of ice. He thinks you are a loose end. Clara, he thinks he can just sweep you away. He will not stop until he has this land, and you. But what can we do? She cried. He has the law. He has the money. We have 1 rifle and a broke-down mule. We have this, Jed said, tapping his temple. And we have you. He thinks you're a weak, cold widow. He's wrong. We're going to use that. They talked for the rest of the night. The $20 debt was the key. Penley wanted the land, not the money. He had used the tax as a way to force her out, or into his bed. We have to trap him. Jed said, make him show his hand. How? He thinks you're desperate, Clara said, the plan forming in her mind. What if I am? What if I'm so desperate? I'm running. Jed looked at her, catching the idea. You're selling. You're leaving. Yes, she said, the plan growing. I'll go to town. I'll tell Mr. Sutton at the general store that I've given up, that I've sold the land to a mining speculator from Helena, and I'm just waiting for the payment to clear before I leave. Penley hears that. Jed continued, his mind working. He can't have that. A real sale with papers would ruin his claim. He would have to act fast to stop it. He would have to get me off the land, Clara finished, before this speculator arrives. He'll come himself, Jed said, his voice hard. Or he'll send his hired men. He won't use the law. He'll use force. He'll try to scare you off, or worse. And when he does, we'll be waiting, Clara whispered. The plan was dangerous. It was desperate. It was all they had. Clara went to Prosperity 2 days later. The mud was thick, and the 20-mile ride on Barnabas was brutal. The town felt different. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were open stares. Women crossed the muddy street to avoid walking past her. Men stopped talking when she entered the general store. Mr. Sutton, a thin man with a nervous disposition, could barely meet her eyes. Mrs. Brody, he said, wiping his hands on his apron. Mr. Sutton, Clara said, her voice loud in the silent store. I need flour, coffee, and 10 cartridges for my Winchester. Sutton flinched at the order for ammunition. Of course. As he weighed the flour, she played her part. She sighed, a long, weary sound. Thank heavens it will be the last time I make this trip. Sutton paused. Ma'am? I've had enough, Clara said, letting her shoulders slump. This land, it's cursed. I'm leaving. I've sold the claim to a mining man from Helena. He's paying me next week, and I'm taking the stage back east. I'm done with Montana. The other 2 customers in the store, both ranchers, stopped and stared. Sutton's eyes were wide. Sold it? But Mr. Penley said the county was... Mr. Penley can have it, Clara said, forcing a bitterness into her voice. This speculator paid me double what it's worth. He thinks there's silver in the creek. I don't care. I just want out. She paid for her goods, her hands shaking slightly. She had set the bait. She rode home, her back rigid, feeling the eyes of the town on her. When she got back to the cabin, she found something new. A piece of paper was nailed to her door. She pulled the nail free and unfolded it. It was a pamphlet, printed on cheap paper. The top, in thick black letters, read, The Wages of Sin and the Harlot of the Plains. Her blood ran cold. She read the words, her sickness growing. It was from Reverend Gideon, the town's fiery preacher. It spoke of a widow of cold heart who had taken a man of violence and sin into her home and her bed. It called her Jezebel. It warned that the wrath of God would soon cleanse the land of her stain. She was still standing there, the paper in her hand. When Jed came around the side of the barn, carrying the axe, he saw her face and was at her side in 3 strides. He took the pamphlet from her trembling fingers. His eyes scanned the page. Clara watched his face. It did not go red with anger. It went white. The muscle in his jaw jumped. Once, twice. His hand, the one holding the paper, slowly clenched, crushing the cheap print into a ball. He did this, Jed said. His voice was almost inaudible, a deadly quiet. Penley. He put the preacher up to this, to turn everyone against you, to make you a pariah. So when you disappear, no one will ask a question. Clara took the wadded-up paper from his hand. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The whispers, the stares, the threats, they were all just noise. The only thing that mattered was the man standing in front of her, and the fight that was to come. She walked into the cabin, Jed following. She went to the stove, lifted the heavy iron lid. The fire was burning bright. She dropped the pamphlet in. They both watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash. My soul is my own business, Clara said. That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The plan was in motion. The trap was set. Now, they just had to wait for the wolf to come. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken fear of what was coming. They lay on the narrow cot, side by side in the dark, not touching. I'm afraid, Clara whispered into the blackness. She felt him turn toward her. I know. What if it doesn't work? What if he kills us? He only kills us if we let him, Jed replied. His hand found hers in the dark, his grip strong and sure. She turned to him, and the fear gave way to a different, sharper emotion, a desperate urgency. Their time was running out. This night, this moment, might be all they had. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not the desperate, pained kiss of their first time. This was something deeper. It was a claiming, it was a promise. He rolled, pulling her on top of him, his hands gripping her waist. Their lovemaking was not slow. It was not tender. It was a fierce, consuming fire. It was a defiance against Penley, against the town, against the fate that was bearing down on them. It was desperate, and it was consuming. His hands were on her back, her hands tangled in his hair, as they moved together, not as two broken people, but as one single, defiant will. It was a promise to live, a promise to fight. Afterward, they lay tangled together, their breath coming hard, the air tasting of sweat and smoke. He held her, his arms like steel bands, and she pressed her face into his chest. She listened to the steady beat of his heart. "I will not let him take you," Jed whispered into her hair, and in the dark, surrounded by a world that wanted her dead, Clara believed him. The truce of the shared cot lasted for 3 days. It was a strange, quiet intimacy, built of shared labor and unspoken fears. They were a team, and the physical act had been less a start of something new than a confirmation of what already was. They were two against the world, but the world was pushing back. "The flour is almost gone," Clara said, her hand scraping the bottom of the sack. "And the traps have been empty for 2 days. The thaw has made the animals wary." Jed was staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the muddy track that led to prosperity. "Penley is waiting. He's let the bait sit long enough. He's heard the story about your mining man. Now he's deciding how to move." "What do? We can't just wait for him to come." "No," Jed said, turning from the window. "I need to know what he's planning. I need to hear the talk. Sutton will have spread your story. I need to know if Penley believes it." Clara's stomach went cold. "You're going into town. I have to." "Jed, no, they're looking for you. That preacher, that pamphlet. They'll know you." "They'll be looking for the man you described," he said, a rough-looking drifter. "I'll give them something else." He went to the small chest at the foot of her cot, the one that held Silas's belongings. He pulled out a pair of trousers, old but clean, and a dark wool jacket that was slightly too tight in the shoulders. He found Silas's spare hat, a respectable black bowler, not the wide-brimmed plains hat he had lost in the storm. "And this," Clara said. She retrieved a pair of spectacles from a drawer. They had been her father's. The glass was thick. "They make the world swim, but they'll hide your eyes." He put them on. He looked at her. The man who stared back was not Jed, the scarred vigilante. He was a clerk, a farmer, someone respectable, someone forgettable. "It will have to do," he said. He saddled Barnabas, the mule's displeasure a low groan. Clara stood in the cabin doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. The Winchester was leaning just inside, where it always was. "Be careful," she whispered. "I will be," he said, not looking at her. He hated leaving her. It felt like tearing something. "Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone but me. Fire a shot if there's trouble. I'll hear it." He swung up onto the mule. "One day, Clara, I'll be back before dark." She watched him ride east, the mule slow, plodding gait eating up the muddy ground. When he was just a speck against the gray sky, she went inside, slid the heavy wooden bar into place, and began to clean a rifle that was already clean. The ride to prosperity was 4 hours of cold misery. Jed kept his head down, the unfamiliar hat pulled low. He passed no one. The town, when he reached it, was a sea of mud. Wagons sunk to their axles, horses tethered to rails, their coats thick with filth. He tied Barnabas outside the general store, giving the mule a quiet pat. "Stay." He did not go into the store. Sutton would know him. Spectacles or not, he needed the source of the rot. He crossed the street, his boots sinking deep, and pushed open the bat-wing doors of the Golden Spike. The saloon was dim, thick with the smell of stale beer, wet wool, and cigar smoke. It was mid-afternoon, and the place was half full. Miners, ranchers, and 3 men in suits. Jed moved to the darkest corner of the long bar, away from the others, and put a nickel on the wet wood. "Whiskey," he said, his voice low. The bartender, a fat man with a dirty apron, slid him a glass, and took the coin. Jed kept his back to the wall. He did not touch the drink. He just listened. He heard talk of the thaw, of a card game, of the price of beef. And then he heard the name. Penley. Tom Penley was at a back table, the one in the alcove, surrounded by the men in suits, and Sheriff Baines was with them. Baines was a thin, weasel-faced man with a drooping mustache and a tarnished star. Perfectly legal, Penley was saying, his voice a low, confident boom. The woman is delinquent. The story about the mining man is a bluff. I checked the wire. No speculator from Helena has been asking about land out here. She's lying. So we just take it? Baines asked, his voice nervous. We don't take anything. Sheriff, Penley said, his voice full of false patience. We followed the law. You will schedule a snap tax auction. Tomorrow, at noon. Right here. Public notice. He tapped a paper on the table. You'll post it on the door. It's all legal. We'll be the only bidders. I'll get the land for the $20 she owes. And if she and that hired man refuse to vacate, you will be there to enforce the county's claim. Baines nodded, smiling. Clean, very clean, Tom. That's how I like it, Penley said, lighting a cigar. Jed felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The plan was a bust. Penley hadn't taken the bait. He had seen right through it. He was using their own trap against them, twisting it with the law. He had to get back. He had to warn Clara. He turned to leave, sliding off the stool. As he did, his arm brushed a man standing next to him. A tall, gaunt man in a long duster. A buffalo hunter by the look of him. Watch it, friend, the man growled. My apologies, Jed said, keeping his head down. He moved toward the door. Hold on, a second voice said. This man was shorter, stockier, with a face like a bulldog. He was standing with the buffalo hunter. They had been talking quietly, but now they were both looking at Jed. You look familiar. Jed's hand moved instinctively to his hip, where his pistol was not. He had left it with Clara. A cold sweat broke out on his neck. I doubt it, Jed said, continuing to walk. The bulldog-faced man stepped in front of him, blocking the door. I think I do. You match a drawing I saw. 10 years old. Maybe. A man with the McKeever crew. A man with an M brand on his ribs. The saloon went quiet. Even Penley's table stopped talking. You're mistaken, Jed said, his voice flat. He could feel the buffalo hunter moving up behind him. Am I? The man sneered. There's a $500 bounty on that brand, put up by Elias Thorne, after you killed his brother in cold blood. He was a rapist, Jed said, the words slipping out, cold and hard. He hadn't meant to say anything. The man's eyes lit up. So it is you. Get out of my way, Jed said. We'll be taking you to the sheriff, the man said, reaching for his gun. Jed did not wait. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He drove his fist into the man's throat. A short, brutal jab. The man choked, his eyes wide, his gun forgotten. The buffalo hunter behind him cursed and grabbed for him. Jed spun, ducking under the man's arm, and drove his elbow into his ribs. He heard a crack. The man howled. Stop him! Sheriff Baines shouted, fumbling for his own pistol. Jed didn't run for the door. He shoved the table at Penley's group, sending men, chairs, and glasses flying. In the chaos, he vaulted over the bar, grabbed the startled bartender, and threw him at Baines. He landed on the sawdust floor behind the bar, scrambled out the back door, and into the muddy alley. He heard a gunshot, the bullet splintering the door frame by his head. He ran, his boots sucking at the mud. The bounty hunter, the bulldog, was right behind him. Having recovered, he was shouting, It's him! $500! Jed reached Barnabas, grabbed the reins. The bulldog man came around the corner of the building. He was raising his pistol. Jed didn't have time to mount. He yanked Barnabas's head around, putting the mule between him and the gunman, and slapped the animal's rump. Go! The man fired. The shot went wide. Jed was already sprinting, cutting between the general store and the smithy. He was in the open. He was unarmed. He saw the bulldog man stop, taking careful aim. Before he could fire, a second man, the tall buffalo hunter, stumbled into the street, clutching his ribs, his own rifle in his hand. I see him! The hunter raised his rifle. Jed dove, rolling behind a water trough. The shot rang out, and a chip of wood exploded from the trough's edge, stinging his cheek. He was trapped. Clara, meantime, had scrubbed the floor. She had mended the blankets. She had fed Barnabas's empty stall a twist of hay she had been saving. Now, she was just sitting in the rocker, the rifle across her lap, watching the sun creep toward the western hills. It was too quiet. She heard the horses before she saw them. Not one, several, moving fast. She was at the door in an instant, her heart pounding. She peered through a crack in the wood. 3 riders. They were not from the town. They were rough, wearing mismatched bits of old uniforms and trail-worn dusters. They were led by a man with a scarred face and one eye that was milky white. They pulled up 20 yards from her cabin, their horses lathered. Mrs. Brody, the scarred man called out. He had a piece of paper in his hand. Clara's hand tightened on the Winchester. What do you want? Got a notice for you, from the county. He unrolled the paper. An eviction. Says you're to vacate the premises immediately. That's not possible, Clara called back, her voice shaking. I have a sale pending. Don't know about no sale. The man cackled, showing yellowed teeth. This here is a writ, signed by the sheriff. Says you're off. Now, you can come quiet, or we can make you... Clara looked at the paper. It was forged. She could see the sloppy signature from here. This wasn't the law. This was Penley. He wasn't waiting for the auction. He was playing both sides. You're liars, she shouted. This is my land. You're trespassing. The scarred man looked at his companions. Trespassing. She's a feisty one. He looked back at Clara. We got our orders. You got 1 hour, lady. Then we're burning you out. The 3 men dismounted. They did not draw their guns. They sat by the wood pile, just out of easy rifle range, and one of them produced a pipe. They were going to wait. Clara's blood ran cold. 1 hour. Jed was gone. She was alone. She backed away from the door and slid the bar into place. She ran to the small side window and looked out. They were settled, laughing. They were Penley's hired thugs. She grabbed the heavy oak table and, with a grunt, shoved it against the door. She dragged the sacks of flour and piled them against the windows, leaving a small gap to shoot through. She was building a fortress. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was cold and clear. She would not run. This was her home. Back in Prosperity, Jed was cornered. The bulldog was coming up the main street. The buffalo hunter was covering the alley. Jed looked up. The wall of the smithy. A stack of barrels. He climbed, his hands scrambling for purchase. He got to the low roof just as the bulldog came around the trough. He's on the roof, the man yelled. Jed ran, slipping on the damp shingles. He jumped from the smithy to the adjoining roof of the general store. It was higher. He heard a shot, the bullet whining past his ear. He ran to the back of the store and dropped, falling 10 feet into a pile of refuse and hay. He landed hard. The wind knocked out of him. He heard the men shouting on the street. He was in the alley behind the store. Barnabas. The mule was still tied where he left him, agitated by the gunfire, but held fast. Jed sprinted to the mule, untied the reins, and vaulted onto his back. There! The bulldog man was at the mouth of the alley. Jed kicked the mule, and the animal surged forward, not with a horse's speed, but with a desperate, bucking power. Jed rode straight at the man. The bounty hunter raised his pistol, his face a mask of surprise. He fired. Jed felt a white-hot pain sear his left cheek. The bullet had grazed him, a burning line of fire. But he did not stop. He leaned low, and Barnabas slammed into the man, sending him flying into a mud-filled horse trough. Jed didn't look back. He kicked Barnabas into a run, galloping out of town, his face bleeding, the shouts of the bounty hunters and the sheriff fading behind him. He was bloodied, he was exposed, and Clara was alone. He rode the mule harder than he had ever ridden an animal, his mind a black storm of fury. The bounty, the auction, Penley. He had walked right into it. He was still 2 miles from the homestead when he heard it, a flat, sharp crack that echoed across the plains. A rifle shot. He drove his heels into the mule's side, his heart climbing into his throat. Clara had waited for 45 minutes. Her fear had turned into a cold, hard stone in her stomach. The men by the woodpile were getting impatient. The scarred one stood up. "Time's up, Jezebel!" he shouted, and started walking toward the cabin. "I'm warning you," Clara yelled, her voice high and thin. "Get off my land!" "Or what? You'll shoot us?" The man laughed. He drew his pistol. "The law's on our side today, girl." He was 10 yards from the porch. Clara rested the barrel of the Winchester in the gap she had left. She sighted down the barrel. He was so close. Breathe out. Squeeze. She aimed at the ground in front of his feet. She fired. The explosion of the rifle in the small cabin was deafening. Splinters of wood sprayed from the wall. Outside, the man cursed and dove to the ground, the bullet kicking up mud where he had been about to step. "She shot at me!" he screamed to his friends, his voice no longer mocking. "She's crazy! Get her!" The other 2 men opened fire. Bullets thudded into the cabin walls. One punched clean through, whining past Clara's head and burying itself in a sack of flour. She was trapped. They were surrounding the cabin. It was then that she heard the sound of the mule, a desperate bray, and Jed's voice, a roar of pure rage. "Clara!" Jed burst into the clearing. He had no gun. He had only the mule and the fury. He rode straight for the 2 men who were firing on the cabin. They turned, stunned. "Who the hell is this?" "It's the hired man!" the scarred one yelled from the ground. "Kill him!" Jed kicked his feet free from the stirrups. As Barnabas passed the first man, Jed launched himself from the mule's back, tackling the man around the waist. They went down in a heap, rolling in the mud. The second man raised his rifle to shoot Jed. Clara, from the window, fired. She didn't aim. She didn't think. She just fired the Winchester. The shot missed, but it was close enough to make the man flinch and dive for cover behind the well. The scarred man was up now. He saw Jed wrestling with his companion. He raised his pistol. "Jed!" Clara screamed, fumbling to reload the rifle. Jed heard her. He slammed his fist into the face of the man beneath him, grabbed the man's pistol from its holster, and rolled. The scarred man fired. The bullet dug into the mud where Jed had been a second before. Jed fired back from the ground. The pistol bucked in his hand. The scarred man grunted, grabbed his stomach, and fell. It was suddenly silent. Jed got to his feet, breathing hard. The man at the well was peeking over the stones. Jed fired at him. The stone chipped, and the man yelped, hunkering down. "Clara!" Jed yelled, running, crouched low toward the cabin. "Are you hit?" "No," she cried. She was dragging the table away from the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get a grip. Jed made it to the porch. He kicked the door, his face streaked with blood from the graze, his eyes wild. "The plan's changed. They're coming sooner than we thought." He burst inside just as she got the bar free. He slammed the door and barred it. He was a mess. His cheek was laid open, blood dripping onto his shirt. His clothes were covered in mud. "You're hurt," she whispered. "It's nothing," he said, checking the pistol. It had 4 shots left. "Bounty hunters? In town. Clara, Penley. He's holding an auction. Tomorrow. He's using the law." These men, he gestured outside. This was just to scare us off, to make sure we weren't there to protest. One man is at the well, Clara said, her voice shaking, but her eyes steady. She picked up the Winchester, reloading it. The one I shot at, the scarred one, is he? He's down, Jed said. The one I tackled is stunned. They're coming sooner, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. This is it, isn't it? This is the fight. Jed looked at her. Her hair was falling from its bun. Her face was pale, smudged with gunpowder. But she was not crying. She was not hiding. She was holding the rifle, and she was ready. A kind of grim pride swelled in his chest. This is it, he said. They moved as one. Barricade the windows, he ordered. All of them. We leave just enough to shoot. The woodpile, Clara said, her mind racing. It's a blind spot. If he gets there. He won't, Jed said. He checked his side. His old wound was aching from the fight, but it had held. We have one rifle, one pistol, 3 men. One is down, Clara said. One is hiding. The other, the one you hit. He's not moving, Jed said. They peered through the crack in the door. The man Jed had tackled was crawling, dragging his leg, toward the woodpile. The scarred man was not moving at all. So it's 2, Jed said. The one at the well, and the one crawling. They worked in the dimming light of the cabin, piling the last of the furniture, the sacks, the bedding, against the thin walls. They were in a fortress, a very small, very weak fortress. They ended up side by side near the cot, huddled in the one corner that was safest, waiting. The man at the well was silent. The man at the woodpile was silent. They were waiting for dark. In the sudden, terrible quiet, the reality of their situation settled. They were trapped. Clara was shaking. What if we live? She whispered, the question so small it was almost lost in the room. Jed stopped. He was checking the pistol again, a useless, repetitive motion. He looked at her. Her face was pale, her eyes huge in the gloom. He saw the terror, but he also saw the iron underneath. He reached out his good hand, the one not slick with his own blood, and touched her face. His rough thumb brushed the gunpowder smudge on her cheek. Then I'll build you something better, he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. Something with a floor that doesn't creak and a roof that doesn't leak. A proper house, with real glass. It was a promise of a future she had not dared to even imagine. A tear traced its way through the grime on her cheek. A shout from outside broke the moment. It was the man at the well. Harlan, are you hit? The man at the woodpile groaned. My leg! It's broke! He broke my leg! Stay there, the man at the well shouted. I'm coming for you! We'll burn them out! Jed and Clara looked at each other. He's going to make a run for the woodpile, Jed whispered. When he does, he'll be in the open, Clara finished. They took their positions. Jed at the main window, pistol resting on the barricade. Clara at the smaller side window, the Winchester's barrel poking through. Now, the man at the well yelled. He burst from cover, firing his pistol wildly at the cabin to cover his run. Jed fired. His shot went wide. The man was fast. He was halfway to the woodpile. Clara tracked him. He was a dark shape, running low. Breathe out. Squeeze. She fired the Winchester. The rifle's kick slammed into her shoulder. The man stumbled, as if he had tripped. He stopped, looked down at his own chest in disbelief, and then fell forward into the mud. He did not move again. The silence that fell was absolute. It was the silence of death. The man at the woodpile, Harlan, started to sob. Luke! Luke! Oh God, they killed him! Clara slid down the wall, the heavy rifle clattering from her grasp. She looked at her hands. They were steady, but her whole body, from her knees to her jaw, was shaking. a deep, bone-rattling tremor that would not stop. She whispered. I killed him. The man at the woodpile was weeping. I give up. Don't shoot. My leg's broke. I give up. Jed stayed at the window, his pistol trained on the woodpile. Throw out your gun! I don't have one. Jedediah, he took it, the man cried, meaning the man Jed had tackled. Jed watched him. He was not a threat. He turned to Clara. She was huddled on the floor, shaking apart. She had done it. She had taken a life. The finality of it was a crushing weight. Jed moved to her, his shoulders screaming in protest. He knelt beside her, ignoring his own pain, and put his good arm around her. He pulled her against his side, his hand gripping the back of her head, pressing her face into his chest. You're safe, he whispered, his own voice rough. You did what you had to. You're safe. We're alive. He just held her, a solid, bleeding anchor in the storm, as she wept for the man she had killed, and for the woman she had been. They did not sleep. They sat in the dark, in the ruins of their fortress, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the bullet holes. Clara's shaking had subsided, replaced by a cold, leaden exhaustion. The body of the man she had shot. Luke lay in the mud, a dark heap, the man with the broken leg. Harlan had gone quiet, his weeping replaced by low, pain-filled moans. We have to go to town, Jed said. His voice was rough. The graze on his cheek had stopped bleeding, but his left shoulder was a knot of pure agony. The bullet from the standoff had gone clean through the meat, missing the bone, but it had left a vicious wound. He had packed it with a strip of cloth, but it was stiff and hot. They'll be looking for you, Clara whispered. She looked at the man she had killed. They'll hang me. They won't, Jed said, his voice flat. You defended your home. There is a witness. He gestured with his chin toward the woodpile. He will tell them what happened. He will tell them Penley sent them. He'll lie. He won't, Jed said. Not if he thinks he'll hang alone. He stood, his body protesting. He bound his wounded shoulder tight against his chest, making a crude sling. Then he went outside, his pistol in his good hand. Harlan, the man at the woodpile, flinched. Don't shoot, he whimpered. Jed ignored him. He checked the other two. The scarred man was dead. The man Clara had shot was dead. 3 bodies. He felt nothing. He retrieved the pistol from the man he had tackled, Harlan's partner. He went back to the sobbing man. You, Jed said, are going to tell the sheriff everything. You're going to tell him Tom Penley hired you. You're going to tell him about the forged eviction. You're going to tell him you were sent to run her off or burn her out. Or, I will tell him I found you standing over these bodies, and that you killed your own partners for their pay. I will leave, and they will hang you. It makes no difference to me. The man's eyes were wide with terror. I'll talk. I swear to God, I'll talk. It was Penley. It was all Penley. Jed nodded. Get up. I can't. My leg. It's broke. Jed looked at the man's leg, twisted at a bad angle. He felt a moment of grim satisfaction. He went and got Barnabas. With Clara's help, they heaved the man onto the mule's back. Jed tied him to the saddle horn. They walked the 20 miles to Prosperity. Clara, her face pale and set, the Winchester in her hands. Jed, his shoulder bleeding through the bandage, his face a mask of dried blood and grim purpose, and Harlan, moaning and weeping, tied to the mule. They were a ghastly parade. The townspeople, emerging for the day, stopped and stared. Mothers pulled their children inside. Men gathered in silent, stunned groups. They looked at Clara, at the bloodied man, and at the dead bodies of the other 2 men, which Jed had tied and dragged behind the mule. Clara had never felt so exposed. The whispers were a physical force, pressing against her. She heard the word, Jezebel, killer. They did not stop. They walked straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Baines was inside, drinking coffee. When he saw them, he dropped his cup. It shattered on the floor. What in God's name? These men, Jed said, his voice quiet, attacked us. They tried to burn Mrs. Brody out of her home. They carried this. He threw the forged eviction notice onto the desk. It was smeared with mud. This one talked. They were hired by Tom Penley. Baines looked at the paper, at the man on the mule, at the dead bodies. He was trapped. The bounty hunters from the saloon, the bulldog and the tall hunter, pushed their way into the office. "That's him," the bulldog yelled, pointing at Jed. "That's Jedediah. He's wanted. Arrest him. Sheriff." Baines looked from the bounty hunters to Jed. He saw his escape. You're under arrest for murder." "Which one?" Jed asked, his voice deadly calm. "The one in Arizona, or the ones who attacked this woman?" "He's a fugitive. Mrs. Brody," Baines said, finding his courage, his hand moving to his gun. "Step away from him." "No," Clara said. Her voice was shaking, but it was loud. "He saved my life. You're not arresting him. You're arresting Tom Penley. He sent these men." "That's a wild accusation," Baines stammered. "He's a witness," Clara said, pointing to Harlan. Ask him right now. Or so help me God. I will ride to the territorial capital and I will tell the marshal you're on Penley's payroll." The office was silent. The bounty hunters wanted Jed. Baines wanted an excuse. Clara would not back down. "This is a legal matter," a new voice said. Judge Sawyer stood in the doorway. He was pale, his hands clasped behind his back. "This is complex." "It's simple," Jed said. "Penley is a murderer. You all know it." "This man," Sawyer said, pointing a shaking finger at Jed, "is a known fugitive. The law is the law. Mrs. Brody, your claim of self-defense will be investigated. But this man, he must be detained." It was a wall. They had built a wall of laws to protect their own. Jed looked at Clara. He saw the despair in her eyes. The law would not help them. "Fine," Jed said. "We'll leave." "You won't," the bulldog bounty hunter said, drawing his gun. Jed grabbed Clara and threw her behind him, moving with a speed that defied his wound. He drew his own pistol, the one he had taken, and leveled it. "Try it." The standoff lasted a second. Baines and the bounty hunters wanted him, but none of them wanted to be the one to die for it. "We will be back," Jed said, "and we will have justice." He backed out of the office, pulling Clara with him. They left Harlan, still tied to the mule, as their testament. They walked backwards until they reached the end of the street. Then they turned and ran. They got back to the homestead, their lungs burning. They were outlaws. "They'll come for us," Clara wept, sliding the bar on the door. "We're done. He won. Penley won." "No," Jed said. He was pacing, his mind a cold, calculating machine. The law had failed, so he would go outside it. "He hasn't won. He just forced my hand." That night, he left her. He took the pistol and a handful of cartridges. "Where are you going?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "To see the judge," he said. "You were right. Clara, they won't listen to a woman. They won't listen to a fugitive. But they'll listen to a gun." He slipped into prosperity like a shadow. The town was alive with tension. The saloon full. Patrols of nervous-looking men, Penley's friends, walking the street. Jed avoided them. He went to the quiet, respectable street where Judge Sawyer lived. He found the house dark, save for a single light in the downstairs study. He moved through the yard like a ghost, picked the lock on the back door with his knife, and was inside. He found Sawyer in his study, a book open on his lap, a glass of brandy untouched beside him. The judge was not reading. He was staring at the wall. Jed stepped from the shadows. Sawyer didn't jump. He just closed his eyes. I knew you would come." "You're a coward," Jed said, his voice a low hiss. He stood over the man. "I'm a pragmatist," Sawyer whispered, opening his eyes. They were terrified. "Penley runs this county. What could I do?" "You could do your job." Jed raised the pistol and pressed the cold, round barrel against Sawyer's temple. Sawyer sucked in a sharp breath. He was shaking violently. "Please, don't. I have a family." "So did Silas Brody," Jed said. "So did the men Penley sent to die on Clara's land. So did the man in Arizona, the one I'm wanted for." "What do you want?" Sawyer whimpered. "Justice. You're going to give it to her." "How? The auction?" "The auction is finished," Jed growled. "You're going to cancel it. And you are going to open a full inquiry into the murder of Silas Brody. You're going to get the territorial marshal. You are going to take the testimony from that man, Harlan, and you are going to use it. You are going to put Tom Penley on trial." "He'll kill me. His friends." "I'll kill you right now," Jed said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I am a dead man. Judge, I've got a bounty on my head and a new murder charge waiting. I have nothing to lose by pulling this trigger. You have this nice house, this brandy, this family. You will do this. You will ruin him. Or your wife will find you here, with your brains on your expensive books." He pressed the gun harder. Sawyer was weeping now, silent tears of terror. "I'll do it." Sawyer gasped. "I'll do it. I swear. I'll send the wire for the marshal tonight." "You do that," Jed said. He pulled the gun back. "And if you're lying, I'll know, and I'll come back." He was gone, melting back into the shadows. Judge Sawyer sat for an hour, shaking, before he ran to the telegraph office. The next morning, the town of Prosperity woke to a new reality. The auction was canceled. Judge Sawyer had confined Sheriff Baines to his office and wired for a territorial marshal, citing evidence of a conspiracy to commit murder, led by Tom Penley. The town was in an uproar. Jed and Clara watched from the homestead. They saw the rider leave, carrying the judge's wire. But Penley was no fool. He knew what a real marshal meant. He knew Sawyer had turned. He knew the game was over. From his vantage point on the hill, Jed saw the activity. He saw Penley, not at the saloon but at the stables, loading his best horse with heavy saddlebags. He was running. Jed didn't go down. He didn't try to stop him. He watched the man who had ruined Clara's life ride north, disappearing into the breaks. "He's gone," Clara said, her voice hollow. "He's getting away." "He's not getting away," Jed said. He turned to her. His face was a hard mask. "He's just getting a head start." "Jed, no, the marshal. Let the law handle it." "The law?" Jed gave a bitter laugh. "The law's what let him do this. This isn't for the law, Clara. This is for Silas. This is for you." He saddled Barnabas. "The marshal will be here in a few days. He'll clear your name, but he'll also be looking for me. I can't be here when he comes." He mounted the mule. Clara grabbed the bridle, her face a mask of panic. "Don't go, Jed, stay. We can fight it. I'll tell them." "You'll tell them the truth," he said, his voice softening for just a second. He touched her cheek, the one streaked with tears, with his good hand. "You'll be safe. He'll never bother you again." "But you," she whispered. "The bounty hunters. The marshal. I've been running my whole life. Clara, it's the one thing I'm good at." He gently pulled the reins from her grasp. "Bar the door." He kicked the mule and rode north, following the trail of the man who thought he was free. He tracked him for a full day. Penley was rich and soft, riding a fast horse. Jed was wounded and grim, on a stubborn mule. But Jed did not stop. He did not eat. He did not rest his aching shoulder. He just followed. The trail led to a rough new mining camp called Devil's Gap, a collection of tents and raw lumber shacks high in the Badlands, a place where no one asked questions. Jed found Penley's horse outside the largest tent. a makeshift saloon and gambling hall. He dismounted, tied Barnabas, and walked inside. The tent was full of smoke, noise, and rough men. Penley was at a table, a bottle of whiskey and a pile of gold coins in front of him. He was laughing, telling a story. His old confidence returned. He was safe. Jed walked through the crowd. The miners parted, sensing the cold fury radiating from him. Jed stopped at Penley's table. Penley looked up. His laughter died. His face, slick with sweat, went the color of ash. "You!" he gasped. "Me," Jed said. Penley scrambled back, his chair tipping over. He reached for the pistol on his hip. He was fast, but Jed was faster. Jed didn't draw his gun. He lunged, his wounded shoulder screaming, and drove his fist into Penley's soft stomach. The man gagged, all the air leaving his body. The tent went silent. "This is between us," Jed announced to the miners. "It's a private matter." The miners looked at the cold, one-eyed killer at the table, and at the rich man gasping on the floor. They went back to their drinks. Jed dragged Penley outside, behind the tent. He threw him into the mud. "Wait," Penley begged, crawling. His bravado gone. "Wait, you want money? I have money. Look." He pulled a bag of coins from his jacket. "It's yours, $1,000. Just let me go." Jed looked at the money, then at the man. "He swung at you," Jed said. Penley froze. "What?" "Silas, at the creek. He swung at you first. That's what you'll say. That it was self-defense." "It was!" Penley cried, latching onto it. "It was? He was a drunk, a fool. He swung at me, and I just pushed him. I didn't mean for him to fall. It was an accident." "And the taxes?" Jed asked, his voice quiet. "The forged eviction, the men you sent to kill her, were they accidents too?" Penley's face crumpled. He saw the end. He started to weep. "Please, mercy, I'll sign a confession. I'll give you everything." Jed looked down at the pathetic, begging man. The man who had pushed Silas from a ledge, who had tried to force Clara into his bed, who had labeled her a whore and sent killers to her door. "You had a choice," Jed said. "You could have left her alone. You could have been a decent man. You chose this." Penley lunged, a desperate, animal move. He grabbed for Jed's legs, trying to pull him down. Jed stepped back and drew his pistol. He did not hesitate. He shot him once, in the chest. Penley stared at him, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his fine shirt. He fell forward into the mud and lay still. Jed stood over him for a long moment, the pistol smoking in his hand. He felt nothing, not relief, not victory, just empty. He turned, got on his mule, and rode west, away from Devil's Gap, away from prosperity, away from Clara. He was a fugitive. He was a murderer. But she was safe. Clara was left behind. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later. He was a hard, quiet man named Elias Thorne. He listened to Clara's story. He read the testimony from the wounded Harlan. He saw the bullet holes in her cabin. "I believe you, Mrs. Brody," he said. He had a weary, sad face. "Your husband's death will be ruled an accident, as there are no witnesses. But the attack on your home, that is settled. This Harlan will testify. Your land is yours. The county's claim is nullified." Clara stood on her porch, bruised and exhausted. "And Tom Penley?" "His body was found in Devil's Gap, shot to death." The marshal looked at her, his eyes sharp. "And the man who helped you, Jedediah?" Clara's heart stopped. "I know that name," the marshal said. "I've been tracking a man by that name, or one of his crew, for 10 years. A vigilante group. There's a $500 bounty on his head for the murder of my brother." Clara stared at him, the blood draining from her face. Elias Thorne, the man Jed had... My brother, Thorne said, his voice heavy, was a violent, cruel man. He deserved what he got, but the law is the law. Jedediah is a murderer, and now he's a fugitive for the murder of Tom Penley. 2, if I see him, Mrs. Brody, I will hang him. Do you understand? I understand, Clara whispered. He left, and the town, which had been held at bay by the marshal's presence, turned on her. She was alone, utterly. Jed was gone. The law had marked her. The town was worse. She was labeled a whore, a murderer's widow. Reverend Gideon preached a sermon about the Scarlet Woman who had brought death and sin to their valley. She went to church the next Sunday, her head held high, her face pale. The congregation parted as she walked down the aisle. No one would sit in her pew. She went to Sutton's general store. He sold her the flour she needed, but his hands shook. Mrs. Brody, he pleaded. My other customers, they won't come in if you're here. Please, just send a list. She was denied supplies at the feed store. We're out, the man said, not meeting her eyes. Her land was spared. No one dared challenge her. The story of the 3 men, of Penley's death, had made her a figure of fear. Amos Hrexka's cattle stayed miles from her property. The men who had once looked at her with lust now looked at her with terror. The isolation was a physical cage, heavier and colder than the winter. Months passed. The last of the winter snows melted. The prairie turned from a dead brown to a vibrant, living green. She survived. She worked. She patched the bullet holes in the cabin walls. She mended the fence. She broke new ground and planted a garden, her hands becoming rough and calloused. She hunted, her aim with the Winchester becoming deadly accurate. She kept the place running. She was strong. She was capable. She was a ghost. She heard nothing from Jed. Not a word, not a whisper. He had vanished. She would lie on the narrow cot at night, staring at the ceiling, her body aching from work, her heart a cold, hard knot. One morning, just as the spring sun was cresting the hills, she went to the porch, and she saw it. It was a small, square box, sitting on the top step. It was made of dark wood, cottonwood maybe, and had been carved by hand. The carving was rough, clumsy, but the lines were straight. Her heart stopped. She snatched it up and ran inside, barring the door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open the lid. Inside, on a bed of dried prairie grass, lay 2 items. The first was a heavy silver coin. It was not American money. It was old, Spanish, the edges worn smooth. In the center, a crude mark had been scratched into the silver, a single, crossed M, a token from his old crew, the only thing of value he probably had. The second was a piece of paper, folded twice. She opened it. The handwriting was crude, blocky, the letters forced onto the page. It was a letter. Clara, he is gone. You are safe. I did what was needed. I am sorry. Her vision blurred, tucked into the fold. She saw more writing, a postscript. I'll return when I'm no longer a curse to you. She stood in the silent, sun-filled cabin. She had her land. She had her freedom. She had her safety. He had given her everything, and he was gone. She sank to the floor, the coin clutched in one hand, the letter in the other. The strength that had held her up for months, the cold, hard wall she had built, crumbled. She broke down, her sobs echoing in the empty room, a raw, desperate sound of a woman truly alone. She pressed the paper to her lips and whispered to the empty air. I don't want clean, she choked, the tears running hot. I want you. The year turned. Summer burned the prairie to a brittle straw color, and Clara's garden, watered by hand from the deep well, became a patch of defiant green. Autumn came, crisp and cold, and she harvested her crops, her hands tough as old leather, her arms strong from the work. She shot 2 deer before the snows came. smoking the meat herself. And the winter returned. It was as harsh as the last, but Clara was not the same. Nearly a year had passed since Jed had ridden north, leaving her with 2 fresh graves on her land and a silence that was heavier than the snow. She had buried the men Jed had killed, Harlan and Luke, in a far corner of the property, marking their graves with simple wooden crosses. She was not a monster. She had transformed. The woman who had hidden behind a wall of cold pride was gone, burned away by gunpowder and grief. In her place was a woman of quiet, unyielding strength. Her farm thrived. The bullet holes in the cabin were patched with new, smooth-cut wood. The fence Amos Hrexka had fixed was now just one part of a new, stronger fence line that enclosed her entire property. Barnabas, whom Jed had left behind, was her steady, stubborn companion. She was no longer shunned in town. She was feared. The whispers had stopped. When she rode into prosperity for supplies, her rifle resting easy in the scabbard by her knee, the townsfolk gave her a wide berth. They called her the Brody woman. They did not call her Jezebel, not to her face, Mr. Sutton had her supplies waiting for her, his eyes nervous, his hands quick. She paid in cash, from the small, secret hoard she had found hidden under Silas's cot, and from the money she earned selling her excess jerky and vegetables. She was strong, she was capable, she was a survivor. But her eyes always searched the hills. Every evening, as the sun began to bleed into the western ridges, she would stand on her porch and look north. She would watch the place where he had disappeared. She kept the small, carved box on the mantel, over the fire. Inside it, the silver coin sat on its bed of grass. The letter was folded in her pocket, its edges soft and worn from her touch. "I'll return when I'm no longer a curse to you." She had survived, but she was still alone. One afternoon in the late spring, as the last of the snows melted and the prairie was exploding in a riot of new grass and wildflowers, a stranger rode into prosperity. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than most, and he sat his horse with the easy grace of a man who had lived in the saddle. But when he dismounted in front of Sutton's general store, he moved with a pronounced limp, his left leg stiff. His hair was darker than most, but his beard was shot through with new, bright gray. He looked, to Mr. Sutton, like a man who had seen too much. He entered the store, his spurs quiet on the floorboards. He wore a respectable hat and a clean canvas coat. "Help you, mister?" Sutton asked, wiping his hands on his apron. The stranger's eyes swept the store. They were gray, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. "Looking for a farm, the Brody homestead." Sutton froze. His nervousness was immediate. "The Brody place? You a friend of hers?" "I am," the stranger said, his voice a low rumble. "Well," Sutton licked his lips, "it's 20 miles east. You can't miss the turnoff by the creek. But I'll warn you, mister, she don't take kindly to visitors. She's a hard woman, prefers to be left alone." "She'll see me," the stranger said. He bought a small bag of coffee beans, paid with a silver dollar, and turned to leave. "Mister?" Sutton called, his curiosity winning out. "I didn't catch your name." The stranger paused at the door, the sunlight on his back. "It's Jed," he said, and he walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Clara was splitting the last of the winter wood, swinging the axe with a powerful, practiced rhythm. The work warmed her, the thunk of the blade biting deep into the cottonwood a satisfying punctuation to the quiet afternoon. She sensed him before she saw him. A shift in the air, a shadow on the edge of her vision. Her hand went from the axe handle to the rifle leaning against the woodpile in a single, fluid motion. She turned. A rider was approaching, coming not from the town road, but from the north, from the hills. He was on a mule. Not Barnabas, but a big, strong animal. He was still 100 yards out, but she could see the way he sat, the set of his shoulders. Her heart stopped. It did not pound. It just stopped. She did not move. She stood with the rifle held loose at her side, her knuckles white. She watched him come. He was different. He was older. His beard, which had been dark, was now laced with gray. He was thinner, perhaps, but harder. He rode with his left leg stiff, not resting easy in the stirrup. He rode into the yard, his eyes dev, ouring her. He looked at the mended fences, the neat wood pile, the healthy-looking mule in the corral, the smoke rising from the cabin chimney. He looked at her, at the strength in her arms, the hard capability in her stance, the way her hair was tied back in a practical, severe knot. He pulled the mule to a stop, 10 feet away. The silence stretched. It was a terrible, beautiful, agonizing silence. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the new grass, the same wind that had always been there. He looked at her, and his face, that hard, scarred mask, was unreadable. Clara's breath, which she had been holding for nearly a year, came out in a long, shuddering sigh. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She let it drop, her hand opening, the weapon falling with a soft thud into the dirt. She walked toward him. She did not run. Her legs felt like lead. Each step was a lifetime. He did not dismount. He just watched her come, his gray eyes burning. She stopped at his knee. She looked up at his face, at the new lines around his eyes, at the faded white line of the bullet graze on his cheek. He was real. He was here. She reached up, her hand shaking, and laid it on his thigh, on the rough canvas of his trousers. She just needed to touch him. Then she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his leg, against the warmth of his body, and she closed her eyes. Jed's hand, calloused and scarred, came down and settled on the back of her head, his fingers tangled in her hair, his grip firm, anchoring her. "I came back," he whispered, his voice rougher than she remembered. "You're late," she whispered against his leg, her voice thick. He grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh. He swung his bad leg over the mule's back and slid to the ground. He landed heavily. His limp pronounced. She pulled back, looking at him. She was as tall as his shoulder. She had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. "You're hurt," she said, her hand going to his leg. "It's old," he said. "It's fine. It's just a reminder." They stood there, just breathing each other in. You're free?" she asked, the question she was terrified to ask. "The marshal? The bounty?" "I'm free," he said. He took her hands. His were hard, but hers were just as hard now. "I went west, to the Utah territory. I found the man, the railroad marshal, who ran the crew Elias Thorne's brother belonged to. He was corrupt, stealing payrolls, killing men, blaming it on outlaws." He spoke in that same low, flat tone, as if telling a simple story. "I got proof. I didn't kill him. I brought him to a federal judge. Elias Thorne. He was there. He came to testify. He saw the proof. He understood. The bounty is gone. My name is cleared. Penley's death. They called it justice. He was a wanted man." He looked down at their joined hands. "I'm not a curse anymore. Clara, I'm just a man with a bad leg, and no money, but I'm free." Clara stared at him, the world narrowing to his gray eyes, to the new silver in his beard. He had done it. He had gone out into the world and fought it, not with a gun, but with the truth, and he had won. "If you still want me," he said, his voice quiet, vulnerable. "If this is still a place a man can come home to." Clara's vision blurred. "I never," she whispered, her voice cracking, "wanted anything else." He pulled her in. His kiss was not the desperate, raw collision of their first time, or the fierce urgency of their last. It was a deep, slow, searing kiss of a man who had been starving and had finally come home. It was salt and dust and promise. She clung to him, her hands gripping his shirt, her body molding against his, and she felt the last of the cold winter ice melt from her soul. That night, they lay on the narrow cot, their bodies tangled. It was too small. It had always been too small, but it was theirs. They made love again. It was different, slower. They were older. Their bodies were maps of new scars, new pains. His limp, her calloused hands. They rediscovered each other, not with the fire of desperation, but with the deep, burning embers of homecoming. It was a quiet, powerful claiming. It was a promise kept. It was not about survival. It was about living. The final scene did not happen that night, or the next. It happened weeks later. The sun was high and hot in a bright Montana sky. The wind was howling, a song of life across the plains. Beside the old, small cabin, a new structure was rising. A new foundation, twice as large, had been dug and laid. The frame of a new wall was built. Clara and Jed stood on either side of the first main roof beam. It was heavy, a great piece of cured pine. Together, Jed said, they bent, their muscles straining. They lifted, they grunted, and with a shared, powerful heave, they raised the beam, setting it into the notches they had cut. They stood back, breathing hard, their shirts soaked with sweat. Clara wiped her brow with a dusty forearm. She looked at Jed. His face was streaked with dirt, his bad shoulder stiff, but he was smiling, a real small smile that reached his eyes. She smiled back, a full, bright smile he had never seen. You're still stronger than I thought. Jed's smile faded, replaced by that familiar, burning fire in his eyes. He stepped off the frame, pulling her with him. He backed her against the new wall of their future home and kissed her neck, his beard rough against her skin. Then let me show you again, he growled. He pulled her into his arms, and she fell against him, laughing, her head thrown back. They stood there, two scarred, strong people, holding each other up as the wind howled across the wild Montana plains, a land where love and grit and fire could survive anything. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West. We love sharing these tales with you. Please take a moment to comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. It's always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, so you never miss a new story. And finally, let us know your thoughts on Clara and Jed's journey. We read all your comments. Thank you.